Hi, Rania.
Hey, Bob.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available in both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Rania Khalek, if I've pronounced that within the bounds of acceptability. Right. Is that close?
That was really good.
Really close?
Yeah, really good.
Better than average?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. I'm feeling good about myself. So I'm really looking forward to this. We're going to talk about the Middle East, Syria in particular, and we're going to do so from an unusual angle, which is your angle. You're different in interesting ways from the average person who opines on Syria and the Middle East. Because for starters, you have a lot of experience. You have family in both Syria and Lebanon. You are in Lebanon right now. In fact, you're in Beirut. Mm-hmm. And we may have, at the end, maybe we'll have time to talk just a little about Lebanese politics because you recently had an election that's very relevant to a lot of this. But also, you've actually been to Syria, unlike, some American journalists who report about it, or at least more than many of the ones who report about it. And then finally, you just have a view of the situation that's very different from a lot of them, so different that it's gotten you some blowback, which we can talk about. That's fair to say, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That's a great summary.
Okay, so, and I want to, before too long, start at the beginning, at like how the Syrian civil war unfolded from your perspective. But first, can you kind of characterize what you would say are some of the main differences between your view and kind of the mainstream media view that Americans get?
Well, I think first and foremost, the view that most Americans get about Syria is extremely one-sided. It's, very black and white. Government is bad and evil and just killing its own citizens. And there's this uprising that took place in Syria, and it's all good and wonderful and democratic. And they were just brutally crushed. And that's why all these people have died in Syria. End of story. That's kind of the view that you get. I mean, the most simple way possible. And my view is that it's much, much more complex than that. Yes, the Syrian government, is an authoritarian government and it behaves in very repressive ways. And I don't deny that, although I get accused of denying that often. But no one's denying that. But the fact of the matter is that the situation in Syria is much more complex and we need to be far more nuanced about it, because the other view that you get from the mainstream is that the U.S. has sort of sat by passively watching this brutal, bloody conflict take place without doing anything about it. When in reality, the U.S. has been a participant in this conflict and has been responsible for a large amount, I would say, of the bloodshed that's taken place in Syria. And we can talk about that and what I mean by that. But that's sort of where I'm coming from, is the U.S. role in this conflict and prolonging it and perpetrating it, which as an American, I think is really important to talk about. And I think Americans should be aware of.
Mm-hmm. And, this is like, there's kind of, I guess it's fair to say that the civil war has to some extent wound down, right? I mean, the Syrian government has regained control of much of the country. And so the rate of killing and the rate of exodus of refugees and so on has slowed. You can even imagine some refugees starting to come back and so on. But am I imagining that there's still, this isn't necessarily kind of a mainstream view, but there's still a lot of agitation for like regime change, right? Which would mean kind of restarting the civil war, right? But I mean, is that your perception that in American politics, the quest to unseat Assad has not died?
No. It hasn't died down. There's just been so many obstacles that have gotten in the way of that quest. And I think the most important one has been the involvement of the Russians and Syrians, because that raises the stakes. Because as soon as the Russians got involved in Syria, it became a situation of if the U.S. wants to get more involved, it could possibly start a hot war with Russia, which is something I don't think that the U.S. wants to do. That's, I think, been one of the most major obstacles to the U.S. getting its way in Syria has been the Russians. Mm-hmm. On top of that, the situation in Syria is oftentimes not even just about Syria, right? It's also about other issues like Iran. Weakening Syria has to do with the U.S. desire to weaken Iran in the region. So there's also like a lot of other complex reasons that the U.S. is involved in Syria that arise when you consider. So I don't think for now, I think you're right. The situation is winding down for sure. I don't think you're going to see, I think if you saw any escalation in Syria, it would probably be between Israel and Iran, which is kind of what's happening right now. But as far as the U.S. is pulling back for the most part, except for keeping some troops in eastern Syria. The U.S. has stopped supporting the armed opposition in Syria, and they're no longer, at this point at least, seeking to topple Assad. They want him weak, but they're not seeking to completely topple him because that would be a catastrophe. I think the U.S. understands that. They understand that if you got rid of the Syrian government, what would take its place would be far worse, and it would actually hurt national security interests of the United States.
So you think everybody in the Trump administration kind of gets that?
I think some people in the Trump administration get that. Others don't. I would say probably the coolest head that understands that is Jim Mattis.
Right.
That gets that. I don't think Donald Trump keeps talking about wanting to pull the U.S. out of Syria. I don't know if he understands why he wants to do that. But he seems to want to. I think there's maybe a couple people that, like John Bolton, he's really hawkish. But I think John Bolton is more obsessively focused on Iran.
Yeah.
So I don't know that the U.S. is so much interested anymore in really regime changing in Syria,
right.
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing for the region.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you said that one of the main obstacles to the U.S. Getting regime change in Syria is Russia. In a way, I mean, in terms of what has helped Assad fend off the threat and preserve his government, I mean, I would say Russia has helped and Iran has helped a lot. Iran is, they're both actually longstanding allies. Russia actually has a naval facility in Syria and has for a long time. But so they've both been helpful to the Syrian government, but they have very different roles with respect to American politics, which is that, as you said, from the point of view of American politics, the prospect of getting into a war with Russia is a deterrent to further military involvement in Syria. But in certain corners of American politics, the prospect of getting into war with Iran is that's like a carrot, not a stick. That's a feature, not a bug. I mean, I think with people like Bolton, that's far from a deterrent. I mean, right? They're like, bring it on.
Yeah, and that's why I think what's scary right now is especially with the unraveling of the Iran nuclear deal, the U.S. backing out of it yesterday.
Right.
That's definitely makes war with Iran far more likely. And we saw an hour after Trump announced that he wanted to back out of the Iran nuclear deal, you saw Israel bombing Iranian assets in Syria and actually killing Iranians, which is happening more frequently. I think that what's taking place is Israel, at the behest of the U.S. in many ways, is actually trying to provoke a reaction from Iran, which so far Iran and Hezbollah have remained extremely restrained. They don't want a war with Israel. I don't even think Israel really wants a war with Iran right now, at least not its military intelligence wing. They say they don't want a war with Iran. So it kind of seems like there's a tug of war taking place in both Israel and more so the United States, where you've got some people who are determined to go to war with Iran, like John Bolton, and also Mike Pompeo is a huge Iran hawk. And then you've got the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs, which are a bit more cautious and a bit more hesitant because they understand. I mean, when you consider what Iran could do a lot of damage to the U.S. in the Middle East, they can retaliate. They don't so far, but they can. I mean, Iran could light the U.S. embassy in Baghdad on fire if it wanted to tomorrow. So there are repercussions to attacking Iran. But it seems like you've got increasingly hawkish figures that are making that prospect more likely. I also think the Europeans, this is, I think, a huge break between the U.S. and the Europeans right now that we're witnessing over the Iran deal. And I think one of the reasons for that is because the Europeans, and this goes back to the war in Syria, by prolonging the war in Syria, by supporting an armed opposition, which actually did give rise to ISIS in Syria, the refugee crisis that we saw in the last several years, especially with refugees flooding into Europe, has actually caused a massive resurgence in the far right across Europe and has in many ways destabilized the EU. You have a lot of right-wing governments and right-wing figures in Europe and in the UK as well that have basically used these images of refugees flooding and walking into European countries to scapegoat them and to scaremonger, and they've won elections over this. Donald Trump won on Islamophobia and hatred for refugees.
What is the position of the European right, the European ethno-nationalist right, the counterparts of Trump, on what should be done in Syria now? I mean, going into the election, Trump's line, and this was to some extent the line of the ethno-nationalists, was non-interventionist as a rule. There was, on the other hand, this kind of weird obsession with Iran that was almost the exception to that, like stay out of wars unless they involve Iran. So what is and now there's a kind of ambivalence in the Trump administration. What does the European ethno-nationalist right have a position on whether, like, everyone should just get out of Syria and leave it to its own devices, or should France send bomb, or what? What is the
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what you do see from the European ultra, like, ethno-nationalist far right. That's the position that you see, is they want people. They're coming from, of course, like an isolationist and us first, white nationalism first
right.
perspective. But yeah, it's let's take care of us here instead of causing wars over there that cause that cause these brown refugees to come to our countries and make the white race impure. That's sort of the attitude that you see, and sadly, that's where most of it's. I mean, it's really sad to say this. That's where most of anti-war attitudes seem to come these days when it comes to public figures, is from these really racist far-right figures. Mm-hmm. And then you really see on the left, or I guess the liberal end of the spectrum, you see an agitation sometimes for more hawkish policies, and you don't really have anyone on the left in a public position except for maybe like Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, who's advocating more wars from a left perspective that isn't hateful. But what I was going to say about the Europeans and refugees is the refugee crisis really did destabilize the EU. And I think it didn't really destabilize the US, and you didn't have refugees coming into the US. Right. You did in the EU. And as a result, European officials and governments don't want more war. They don't. So I don't think you're going to see them backing a war with Iran like they might have with Syria. Mm-hmm. So I think the US is kind of on its own in this one, except for Israel and Saudi Arabia on its team.
Okay, so just a couple of quick things. I mean, I think you're right that Secretary of Defense Mattis stands apart from some other Trump advisors in his reluctance to get into conflict. On the other hand, he lost the argument about the Iran deal, so he's not exactly in a position of great power within the administration, so far as we can tell. On the Israel thing, I mean, I think it's a good question. Does Israel want a war? I mean, in a way, Netanyahu politically could use one because he's in hot water, or he's got his own little corruption scandal. But I think, to the extent, I think the aim of like the security establishment in Israel is more like they find very threatening the idea of Iran, bringing missiles and proxies into Syria, because those could threaten Israel. I actually wrote a piece for The Intercept raising the question of whether those could not, whether Iran's motivation isn't actually more defensive in the sense of establishing a very credible deterrent so that Israel won't bomb it and so on. But in any event, Israel finds that threatening, and they want to lay down the law. And Iran is in this awkward position that, like, if it retaliates, because the nature of its deterrent, it's the form of retaliation most open to it involves killing civilians, basically. I mean, it doesn't have the defense, the kind of sophisticated defense, defense that Israel has, and that's just kind of a public relations disaster. Although that is the threat, the stick it holds over Israel. So I think you are going to see Iran continue to be reluctant to respond. I don't know what's going to happen there, but it certainly seems more dangerous now that the nuclear deal is.
Well, also, I think with what some people don't always, and I saw your piece, by the way, at The Intercept. I thought it was really, really great. And I think that one thing that people also don't realize about Iran, first, when it comes to Israel, the Israelis are extremely paranoid. They think that they see Iranians everywhere, sometimes in places that they're not. And so I think a lot of what you hear is, yes, there's the political end of it where you've got, Netanyahu using the Iran's, scaremongering about Iran for political purposes. But you also have this really extreme paranoia about, the Israelis losing sort of like their domination of the region and just seeing Iran everywhere. As far as Iran and Hezbollah are concerned, though, they, I think, first and foremost, see Syria they don't see Syria as a situation involving really Israel. For them, it's more of a national security issue when it comes to Sunni extremism. That's their issue in Syria, defeating groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda, because those groups actually in the last, since the war in Syria started, that has become the primary threat to Iranian Hezbollah type forces, is the rise of Sunni extremism in the form of al-Qaeda, ISIS, and its various clones. And so that is, and you've heard Nasrallah say this on a few occasions, is that's sort of become the preeminent threat for them, even more so than Israel
Nasrallah
has.
being the leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Right. And so their positions and their activities inside Syria have far more to do with, first of all, maintaining, obviously, first and foremost, making sure the regime in Syria and the state in Syria stays intact, because that's crucial, especially for Hezbollah's survival, but also protecting their own borders from extremism. In the case of Hezbollah, protecting the Lebanese border and protecting the integrity of that border, and which actually did become at one point very porous, and you had a lot of extremist groups come into Lebanon from Syria. And the same goes for Iran. They see it as we have to fight them there before they come here, which unfortunately sounds like kind of Bush-style language, but that's sort of what you've seen adopted in the Middle East because of the rise of these groups, these extremist groups. And again, I think what's really interesting, though, is that in the case of these extremist groups in Syria, Israel has actually played a role in supporting some of them in the Golan for its own interests of sort of trying to keep the Golan indefinitely.
Okay, the Golan being originally Syrian territory that was taken by Israel is technically, under international law, Syrian territory under Israeli occupation. Let's. I want to say one more thing before we start at the beginning and kind of talk about the whole unfolding of the civil war. Is in talking about kind of Sunni extremists, you touch on another thing that I think distinguishes your view from many. I mean, I'm not an expert on this area at all, and but I look at the situation now and I go like, things are finally dying down. When people start talking about we still have to get rid of Assad, I'm like, do you want to see another, millions more refugees, hundreds of thousands more dead? Because that's what we're talking about at this point. You're talking about reigniting a civil war. So on those grounds, I mean, that's kind of the extent of my view on why it's not wise. But I think you add something to the picture. As I understand it, you make the point that, leave aside the destabilization that this would cause, it's far from clear that the people who would be in power if you unseated Assad would be preferable to Assad from the point of view of most Syrians, right?
Absolutely. And, a lot of times you've seen this war in Syria framed as a war between Alawite, a really evil Alawite regime that's just, in some cases you actually see the mainstream press perpetuate this notion that it's a genocide against Sunnis in Syria. But Syria it's a majority Sunni country. The majority of the Syrian army is made up of Sunnis because they make up the majority. And for them, there's lots of Syrians who don't like their government. It's normal, especially government like theirs. But for them, the alternative that was being proposed to them was atrocious. It was not preferable in any sense. It was an alternative that was made up of a collection of Salafi jihadist groups that told you what their intention was. Their intention was to purify Syria of non-Sunnis and forcibly convert people who aren't Sunnis and impose this extreme Wahhabi-style version of Sunni Islam that Sunnis in Syria that's not culturally, what they're like. That's very foreign to them. And so I think that's really important to talk about, because when we talk about the kinds of people that the U.S. supported in Syria and its allies supported in Syria, I would say it's kind of the equivalent of American adversaries coming into the U.S. and supporting the KKK and white nationalists to overthrow the U.S. government, to overthrow Donald Trump and replace him with those kinds of groups.
Actually, I'm not sure all those people would want to overthrow Donald Trump, but that's another issue.
but my point is that Donald Trump is not someone we like. Most people, especially liberals, like as president. However, if the alternative to someone as awful as Donald Trump was, the KKK and groups like it, even people who hate Donald Trump would not want that to take his place. So that's kind of how I think that's a good way to, at least from the American point of view, to look at Syria, to kind of understand it in a from the American reference point, if you will. And so I think and it's also for people like me. I'm somebody I'm Middle Eastern. Yes, I'm American, but I also am Lebanese, family in Syria. They're from a minority sect. I'm personally an atheist. I don't really care when it comes to religion, but to Salafi jihadist groups, that doesn't matter. As a woman, if I were to live in an area of Syria that would be taken over by the alternative that people were presenting to Assad, I would have my rights stripped away as a woman, and I would likely be forcibly converted, or maybe killed. I'm killable to some of these groups. So, I'm just trying to, in that sense, people, need to understand that yes, the government sucks, but the alternative sucks way more.
This is a common problem in politics.
Right.
So, okay, so let's start from the beginning. So way back, I don't even know how long ago it was that this war started, but it was kind of in the what was called the Arab Spring had been unfolding, and so far it had seemed like you just people rise up, demand their rights, and pretty soon the leader abdicates. That had happened a couple of times, and I remember when you basically, you had these protests in Syria. The crackdown was absolutely brutal from the beginning. I don't think there's any denying that. If you look at how Assad tried to repress it and throw junior high age kids in jail for doing graffiti and stuff, there's no doubt about the brutality, but the perception from the West was, okay, these are laudable, people who want their rights, which I think, was true. They were the kind of people we do commend. And the sense was that it was them against Assad, and Assad must go because they're better. And Obama kind of said, I think at some point, Assad must go, just because at that time there was still the feeling that that's all you had to do in the Arab Spring. Just say so-and-so must go, and they would go. But anyway, it became more complicated than that, and the people we were lauding, and you're telling the story, the people we were lauding who just kind of, icons of liberalism in the sense that they wanted free expression and so on, are far from the only people who wound up being involved in the civil war. So, first of all, how did it become a civil war? These people weren't armed. They didn't have. How did it become a thing involving so much killing?
Well, there's a lot that went into it. And like you said, yes, there were people in Syria who just, people like us, right? They just kind of, liberal-minded, progressive-minded people who want more freedom of expression, a more democratic society. I've met those kinds of people who were involved in the beginning in those protests. And the way I explain it is that in Syria, you had two streams of protesters. It wasn't just one stream of protesters. You had the kinds of, democratic minded types who wanted basic reforms, and that they have every right to call for that in Syria. The government in Syria does need to change in many ways. So those kinds of people in more of the urban centers of Syria, a lot, mostly young people, idealistic types. But in the more rural areas and suburban areas, you also had what I would call right-wing protests, which were, these sort of sectarian, religiously conservative type protesters who were demanding things like, reading, allowing the books written by Ibn Taymiyyah, who's a very, who's sort of the godfather of Salafism, if you will. He's an Islamic scholar, that a lot of his ideas have inspired groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS. Allowing us to read Ibn Taymiyyah, allowing, women in schools, teachers in schools to wear niqabs, having gender segregated schools. Those were the demands that those protesters were making. And you can go, sometimes it's funny, you would have the New York Times or the Washington Post promoting videos of protests. And sometimes they would even promote these videos of protests where people are making these right-wing demands. But I guess, whoever was promoting them on their websites wouldn't know what they were saying in Arabic, but that's what some people were calling for. And so you had I would kind of describe it. It's almost like in the U.S. having Occupy Wall Street on one hand and having the Tea Party on the other hand. You wouldn't call those so one
those
uprising,
were
right?
Those were the two factions in a civil war that, from our perspective, seemed to have a unified kind of character to the insurgency.
Right.
In fact, they were almost at opposite ends of the spectrum.
Absolutely. And so that's why things start to get confusing about Syria, because yes, the government's response was brutal. It was repressive. It was very stupid. Sometimes they floated stupid conspiracy theories that nobody bought. At the same time, the government was also these protests from the beginning were not all peaceful. You did have some elements of protesters, especially the more right-wing elements, that were firing at security. Sometimes, you'd see clashes. Police officers would be killed. quite regularly in Syria. So it wasn't like a one-sided fight. Again, I'm not denying the brutality of the government's response, but it's much more complicated than that. And you also did have groups like Ahrar al-Sham, for example, which was one of the insurgent groups in Syria, forming as early as January 2011, before the protests in Syria even started. So there were some people who were starting to get arms. You had weapons being smuggled into Syria through Lebanon, which is, interestingly enough, you had some Al Jazeera Arabic journalists who were trying to report this, and you actually had a mass exodus at one point from Al Jazeera and the creation of a brand new outlet called Al Mayadeen, which is a Lebanese outlet, by the former Al Jazeera staffers who quit because of the biased coverage of Syria.
Yeah, because Al Jazeera is run by basically the government of Qatar, right?
Exactly.
And they were among the countries that wound up supporting various rebel factions, right?
They were deeply involved. I've actually talked to a lot of people who worked for Al Jazeera at the time who no longer work there, and some people who still do. And they've told, according to them, Al Jazeera would just inflate the death toll in Syria. They're Al Jazeera Arabic in particular. Their entire narrative that they promoted about Syria was, obviously very Qatari government fueled in their interests, but also, they played a massive role in perpetuating this very sectarian narrative that began to sort of drive and give a narrative to the insurgency that formed in Syria. Also, can
you flesh that narrative out? What do you mean exactly by sectarian narrative?
That this was a war that was being perpetrated by an Alawite government, a minority government that just wanted to kill Sunnis because they're Islamophobic and hate Sunnis. When in reality, the Syrian government is actually made up of Sunnis. Yes, Assad is Alawite, and of course, because of nepotism, his immediate family does benefit from him being in power. But at the same time, the Syrian business class, some of the richest people in Syria, they're Alawite and they support the government. They work in cooperation with the government. The government could not survive without the support of Sunni elites in Syria. And of most Sunnis in Syria.
Can I just pause and say, I think there's an interesting thing here, which is, I think, first of all, a number of liberals like me were kind of slow to get the picture in Syria. Like, at first I just couldn't figure it out. It's like, I'm not big on intervention. I'm not big on regime change, but I don't know what the solution is. And it took me a while to come to the conclusion that, if us and our allies just had not funneled arms into the region, we would be in a much better place. And I think among the reasons it was hard to figure things out is like Al Jazeera, from the point of view of a liberal like 7 years ago, it was a relatively credible outlet in some ways compared to the American press. On certain Middle Eastern issues, it did not share some of the biases that I might attribute to the mainstream American press. And so it had a kind of credibility in liberal circles. And this is just one example of the situation in retrospect having been so complex. And I know you're facing this in terms of like where the blowback is coming from. That's not a simple story in terms of like where you're getting flack from, but it's just an example of how little people like me actually understand about the region.
Well, I think, so I want to make a distinction between Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera Arabic. I think Al Jazeera English, for the most part, is a really great outlet, especially with issues that don't concern the Middle East. I think they are biased, depending on what Qatari policy is around the region. They're very biased on Syria, obviously, but they don't come anywhere close to Al Jazeera Arabic.
Okay.
Al Jazeera Arabic is like, you wouldn't recognize it if you could understand what they were saying. It's like Fox News on steroids.
Wow.
And the way it covers the Middle East. It went from being a voice, because it was very popular in the Middle East, but it went from being a voice of like Arab nationalism to, after the 2011 Arab Spring, it became a voice of Sunni nationalism. And it became extremely sectarian. And again, like, you had a mass exodus because of this shift in tone at Al Jazeera Arabic. You actually have the most popular talk shows promoting genocide against Alawites on Al Jazeera Arabic. People in the English-speaking world don't know this, but they would be appalled if they were to see the kind of rhetoric that became the norm on that channel. And on top of that, Al Jazeera Arabic also, had a lot of Muslim Brotherhood, ideologues in it. Also had people who were involved in the war in Afghanistan involved in Al Jazeera Arabic. who played a role like sort of in the Mujahideen. So there was a bias there. And, I actually talked to a lot of Iraqis about this because in the rest of the region loved Al Jazeera Arabic, especially their coverage of the Iraq War, right? From a lot of the other channels, you have this idea that there was this awful, that Al Jazeera Arabic sort of portrayed the people who were fighting the Americans as heroes. And in this region, that attracts the popularity. Right. But the reality is when you go back and look at their coverage, Al Jazeera Arabic specifically in Iraq, they were actually whitewashing oftentimes what was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Iraqis were really angry about this, especially Iraqi Shias. They were very angry about this because their areas were the ones that were getting blown up. And then you had a lot of Shia resistance groups in Iraq that Al Jazeera Arabic would give no attention to. So Iraqis kind of recognized this double standard, at least in my conversations with them long ago. But then as soon as the Arab Spring happens, you had a lot of other Arabs around the region that started to recognize this about Al Jazeera Arabic, and then Al Jazeera Arabic just went into overdrive. Mm-hmm. Faisal Al-Qasim is like one of the most popular talk show hosts on Al Jazeera Arabic, and it was on his show. They had an entire segment devoted on, is it appropriate to kill all Alawites, including women and children? And the response was yes, it is. Yeah, it was like a whole debate. And you can actually go watch it on YouTube. I think somebody subtitled it in English because it was just so shocking. But that was sort of the regular programming you started to get from Al Jazeera Arabic. And it had an impact on the way that people thought on the ground. Mm-hmm. And Al Jazeera Arabic also promoted Al-Jalani, as though he was a hero, who was the leader of Al-Nusra, which is the Al-Qaeda franchise in Syria.
Right.
At some point there should be a retrospective written about just Al Jazeera Arabic and its transformation, because it's kind of shocking when you look back and really study it.
Okay. And we won't even get into this, but another dimension of complexity is there's this famous tension now between Qatar on the one hand and Saudi Arabia, but both of them were involved in funneling arms into the civil war, maybe to somewhat different factions, but in any event, kind of to get back to that. So there's this uprising. It's initially peaceful. Arms start entering the picture, and by and large, the serious weapons were funneled in by outside players, right, including the United States, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, I don't know what, UAE,
Turkey.
Turkey's a long-standing rival of Syria. And I guess they were supporting somewhat different groups, but before we get into that, if even assuming that's not too complicated to get into, what is the range of players that we and our quote allies, because all these people are nominally our allies, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, us. What is the range of players that we were actually supporting? You've alluded to this. These people are, as we would normally view them, dangerous radicals. But why don't you just review the spectrum of people we were giving arms to and what their actual aspirations are?
Well, and oftentimes, the people getting arms would start entering the fight because you get money, mm-hmm. right? And you get weapons, and you get to control areas where the government's been expelled. And so sometimes we'd be giving money to, it wasn't always, it's almost simple, it's too simplified to say it was always Islamic radicals. Sometimes it was just criminals, your common criminal. Some cases it was I believe the leader of Nur al-Din al-Zinki, which is one of the groups that at one point in time the CIA had determined was a moderate group. The leader of that group was a guy who used to be a butcher, he used to sell meat.
An actual butcher, not as in the butcher of Baghdad or that, just an actual guy who sold.
Yeah, beef. He was a guy who, his name is blanking on me right now. But he was, he had actually almost gone to prison for honor killing his sister. He was from the countryside of Aleppo, and he was a meat butcher, he was I think he sold sheep or some goats, a goat mm-hmm. butcher, something along those lines. I don't think he even graduated high school, although he called himself a sheikh. But he didn't actually have the credits to be a sheikh. But that was who became the founder of Nur al-Din al-Zinki, later a group that ended up became famous for beheading a Palestinian teenager on video, but was no longer considered a moderate group of the U.S. at that time, but was armed by the U.S. at some point. You have Ahrar al-Sham, which is a Salafi jihadist group that actually started forming in Syria back in January of 2011. But it was never considered a moderate group, but they were mostly backed by, I think, a combination of the Qataris and the Saudis. They were sort of playing them against each other at different times, which you saw with a lot of groups. You also had, the FSA. Of course, a lot of these groups fell under the,
that's
the
FSA, the Free Syrian Army. Is that what that stands for?
Yeah.
And they were nominally they were like the good guys from. I mean, that brand was one that that was like a good brand from America's point of view.
It was supposed to be, but in fact, what you ended up seeing was just a collection of different groups calling themselves different names, oftentimes sectarian names, falling under this umbrella of the FSA. But even if they weren't Al-Qaeda, they were almost always working alongside Al-Qaeda and what ended up becoming ISIS. Mm-hmm. And they would call them all the time. On Al Jazeera Arabic, you would see them calling these people their brothers in arms. And sometimes this caused scandals for the U.S. because you had certain leaders in the FSA that the U.S. was funding who would go on Al Jazeera Arabic and say, we couldn't have done this, or, we couldn't have captured this, air base without the cooperation of our brothers in the Islamic State. And this would happen quite often. It didn't really become a problem, though, until ISIS declared itself and started beheading Westerners.
So how big a role did this funneling of arms play in the actual development of ISIS? I mean,
so the development of ISIS, first of all, like going back to where ISIS comes from, of course, ISIS was Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Right.
That initially became the Islamic State in Iraq. And when the U.S. and its allies started funneling weapons, a lot of weapons, to various insurgent groups in Syria, what you would see is that the Syrian government would be expelled from certain areas, like eastern Ghouta, for example, eventually East Aleppo, other areas of the country, Homs. And so when you had the collapse of the government, basically people with weapons would just take over. Eventually, what happened is ISIS would go in and start kidnapping Westerners, mm-hmm. And sometimes other people too, sometimes like local Arabs, but oftentimes when they kidnap Westerners, they could get these massive ransoms for the people that they kidnapped. And this kind of gave them the startup funding they needed to consolidate their forces in eastern Syria. And ultimately, because they made this base in Syria, they were able to invade Iraq and take over large portions of Iraq. But more importantly, probably than all of that, is the Turkish border. The Turkish government knowingly allowed foreign fighters, tens of thousands of foreign fighters, to flood into Syria from like 80 different countries. I think there's like 80 different nationalities that were involved in ISIS and all these other groups in Syria. And this also gave them the manpower they needed, because those people joining their ranks made a huge difference. And this was done with the U.S. kind of like turning a blind eye. Mm-hmm. They knew it was happening, and they didn't really care.
So when I remember back when ISIS, they would like do these ads in trying to attract foreign fighters, and like, here we've established this paradise, and and every man gets a beautiful wife and so on. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I guess we're failing to stop that. But I mean, what you're saying is Turkey was actually, in effect, encouraging that. I mean, they wanted Absolutely. They wanted that flow to happen. They wanted. This is our NATO ally, Turkey, wanted to fill the ranks of ISIS in Syria.
I mean, I don't know. Okay, I don't know what was taking place in Turkish, privately among Turkish officials. I don't know if that was, something they said out loud or were actively planning, but they had to have known. I mean, it's pretty obvious. I remember seeing a lot of news reports at the time, like back in 2012, 2013, especially in 2013. Of like journalists would just get on a plane and you'd see like all these foreign jihadists on planes in Turkey, on planes, and they were at the airport. There would be like booths set up to recruit people, like openly. Obviously, this stopped at some point. I think what happened is all this stopped when ISIS became a real threat to the governments that maybe were encouraging its form. Maybe I don't know if it's its formation.
So whether knowingly or not, they had helped seed ISIS.
Absolutely. At the very least, we can say that.
Right. Okay. So then the people that we and our allies are supporting include a lot of people whose ideologies we would not actually approve of if we looked at them closely and would in fact find threatening. And you're saying many Syrians found them threatening. Many of the people were in fact not even Syrians. They were foreigners who were brought in because they seemed to serve the agenda of Syria's regional rivals. Mm-hmm. And so there we are. And, of course, finally, Russia intervened. It looks bad. For a while, everyone thought Assad was doomed. Mm-hmm. Russia intervenes, not surprisingly. Like I said, they have a naval facility there, longstanding ally of theirs. America, if some country where we have an actual military base was attacked, you can bet we'd show up.
Not just that, I also think the Russian intervention also a big reason for that had also to do with the way that Libya turned out.
Well, right. I mean, that's part of the background of this is that Russia had gone along with the Security Council vote for an intervention in Libya that they thought was going to be confined to protecting a population. It morphed into a regime change operation, arguably exceeded the mandate at that point, and at that point became illegal under international law. And they were very unhappy about that. And of course, Libya, it's the second straight regime change operation that you would think would illustrate that regime change is just a disaster. But I digress. Anyway, right. So Russia intervened. Iran, and in particular Iranian proxies and allies like Hezbollah, there's a lot of support coming in from Lebanon. Hezbollah comes in to help the Assad regime. So anyway, the tide is turned, and in the course of Assad reasserting control over most of Syria, you get these recent things that the world is very familiar with of Assad, trying to expel. Well, depending on how it's perceived, he would say he's trying to expel remaining rebel groups from population centers. The way it often looks, and the way it often looked to me, was it's a pretty damn indiscriminate way of getting rid of them. He seems not very averse to collateral damage. And in some cases, for all I know, his actual agenda is ethnic cleansing, if in fact there is a lot of popular support for the rebels in the area. I mean, that's the spectrum of possibilities I saw, and maybe that's the spectrum that there was. But what I gather, it differs on a case-by-case basis what's actually been going on. And of course, in some cases, he's been accused of using chemical weapons. Very recent example of that we can talk about. But in any event, it was pretty brutal. What does all that stuff look like from your, and you've actually been in Syria during this. What does this look like from your perspective?
Well, so I would obviously I would agree that the way the methods that the Syrian government has used have not been good. They've been it's been very destructive. They bomb a lot, from most of the nation. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to understand that this is counterinsurgency, and this is why we should have been promoting the end of this war, because by promoting these insurgents groups, we helped create the conditions on the ground for this to be the ultimate ending. And unfortunately, this is what it ends up looking like. And it's not just the Syrian government doing this. You also see the same situation in Iraq with the expulsion of ISIS. You see the same tactics actually being used, where you have the area under siege, people end up, and you also have the armed groups that are in charge hoarding food and hoarding weapons and operating from civilian areas, and in some cases using civilians as human shields quite proudly. So this is the environment that both the Iraqi and Syrian government were operating under. And I think that the methods being used should, of course, be criticized. However, I do think it's interesting that it's only the Syrian government methods that are criticized, whereas for some reason when it's ISIS that's being routed or expelled, and it's the U.S. Backing the Iraqis to rout ISIS, it's perfectly fine. And there's not much debate, and it's considered liberation. And so I think that that's kind of like more of, the angle I like to look at it from, because I'd like to say that, that becomes not a conversation or debate about necessarily what the Syrian government is doing alone, but what counterinsurgency looks like. Right. And maybe that's the problem. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, that's what the Syrian government was doing. And it looks awful, but the U.S. was doing the same exact thing to rout ISIS.
Yeah, probably with somewhat. We have more sophisticated weapons. Like I remember when we went through, this wasn't probably ISIS. This wasn't ISIS per se, but when we went through Ramadi in Iraq, we went through it with, we had better weapons, better trained troops, and so on. We went through it, on the one hand, with more surgical precision. On the other hand, at the end of the day, the city was devastated. We just went through block by block, and in the end, you have to blow up a lot of buildings and kill a lot of people. I don't doubt that it was there was less collateral damage than, say, you get with barrel bombs, or in the cases where chemical weapons are used. Certainly with chemical weapons.
Actually, I think you get more. I think you get actually more casualties from conventional weaponry than chemical weapons. I actually think that. I think you can do way more damage. It looks like, at least with conventional weapons. You've seen the damage it's done, and that's what I will say is in Syria. I visited areas that were retaken by the government. I visited East Aleppo. visited the old city in Homs, which several years ago was retaken by the Syrian government. And one thing you notice right away is that the areas where the insurgents were holed up are completely devastated, and it's pretty indiscriminate. Everything is bombed, but it's kind of isolated to only the areas where the insurgents were holed up. So it's not like the entire city is devastated. Like eastern Aleppo is devastated for sure, but western Aleppo isn't. But in Homs, it's like just the old city is devastated. The rest of Homs is normal and like moving on, like nothing happened.
So wait, so which kinds of weapons were used in Homs to expel the insurgency?
I'm pretty sure it was the same conventional. Actually, I think it was before the Russians got involved. Mm-hmm. So it would have mostly been whatever the Syrian government had in an arsenal. It's an arsenal, so it's like barrel bombs, I suppose, were probably a huge weapon there. But in Homs, you do know, the old city is completely, like every single building is ruined. I also got to visit Rania, which was taken back by the government a couple of years ago. And that, it's a complete ghost city. Like no one lives there anymore. You can't. It's just every single building is touched. Yeah. And the same goes for East Aleppo. And it's awful, but the same also goes for Raqqa. Like, I don't agree with these tactics or methods at all, but it does seem like we could have prevented this from happening. And it's too late to say that now. But maybe in the future we shouldn't arm insurgencies.
So expelling insurgents from an urban area is an inherently devastating and thing, and so you would like to avoid getting in that situation in the first place. Now, what is the range of reaction of the people in the neighborhood? Is it like sometimes the insurgents do have the popular support, so that maybe the regime is thinking, hey, if we get them all to flee, fine. In which case, I would think chemical weapons would be something that the regime might think about, because it's an effective ethnic cleansing weapon. Although, barrel bombs might, as you suggest, might do just as well. But in any event, is it the case that sometimes the insurgents really have deep-rooted grassroots support, and in some cases they came from the outside and don't? Are there both of those kinds of cases?
Yeah. That's absolutely the case. I would say, for example, insurgents in Eastern Ghouta, they definitely they came from Eastern Ghouta. They were from many of Jaish al-Islam, one of the biggest insurgent groups, wasn't made up of foreign fighters. It was made up of Syrians, and a lot of them from that area. So ultimately, Eastern Ghouta was a very conservative area to begin with. So in some cases, if you have Salafi jihadist groups taking over, and almost every woman is already covered from head to toe, and people pretty much follow Islamic law as it is, it's not much of a difference for you if a group like Jaish al-Islam, which was funded by Saudi Arabia, which was the largest insurgent group in charge in Eastern Ghouta, if a group like that takes over, it's not that different for you, at least in the beginning. So I would say maybe those, and oftentimes it's husbands and brothers and sons that are joining. So in an area like that, sure, there was likely popular support. I haven't talked to people from that area. I've only talked to people who fled that area, and oftentimes they flee because people were fighting and shooting at each other. That's kind of ultimately why people flee in the first place. Not necessarily because one side shot them, but they just, there was fighting. An area in Aleppo, though, I think Aleppo was different. Aleppo, a lot of the insurgents came from the countryside to take over, and they weren't necessarily from the neighborhood. That was where you saw a lot of al-Nusra, a lot of Ahrar al-Sham types. Al-Nusra especially had a lot of foreign fighters. You had some ISIS elements that took over some of the countryside in Aleppo. But for Aleppo, that was different. The Aleppo was very pro-government in the beginning, and they were taken over violently. That was violently imposed on people there. And I'm sure I'm sure at the end of the day there was some popular support, but I definitely think that's why you have to kind of look at different areas to see. It's definitely different. Raqqa, for example, was actually very pro-government. It was a very conservative place, but it was very, very pro-government. In fact, back in the beginning of the uprising, if you will, Raqqa was often mocked by opposition activists for being regime supporters. And so when they were taken over by insurgent groups, I think within 6 months, the governor of Raqqa was executed by Nusra, and before ISIS took over. So it really depends place by place where you're talking about. But of course, you have to have at least a little bit of popular support, I suppose. In the beginning, you have to have people who are willing to help you. And so there were Syrians who did, for example, allow foreign fighters come and stay in their homes, not really understanding what this would mean down the line. So there was some of that too. But ultimately, I wouldn't say that I would say the government has used indiscriminate methods. They've used a lot of extreme violence to rout insurgent groups. At the same time, I wouldn't call it ethnic cleansing because that would suggest, I mean, ethnic cleansing has a definition, and that would suggest the government was trying to remove a certain ethnicity, or for, I guess in the case of Syria, a certain religion from certain areas. But like I mentioned earlier, the Syrian Arab army is majority Sunni. So you would be talking about Sunnis removing Sunnis from Sunni areas, which doesn't really make sense. The reason that most of the areas targeted happen to be majority Sunni areas or entirely Sunni areas is because the insurgents are an entirely Sunni phenomenon. And so they couldn't take over Alawite areas. They couldn't take over Druze areas. They could take over Sunni areas because they could find at least a little bit of support in those areas.
Okay. So then were there, so there were not cases of the kind of large scale population transfer that you associate with ethnic cleansing. It was like,
yeah, I wouldn't say that. There was population transfer in the sense that you're getting, okay, so sometimes the government gives the option for people to leave the area. You can either stay or, and agree to live under Assad Syria. That's basically your option. Or you can leave and go to Idlib. That's the option. And that's sometimes you have insurgents that take their families with them to Idlib. In some places, the government would try and evacuate civilians. And again, this is the government's line of thinking. They're not thinking we're ethnic cleansing. They're thinking evacuate civilians because it makes it easier to just kill all the insurgents.
Right.
That's their frame of thinking. At the end of the day, the civilians end up going back. So it's not like they're trying to keep people from going home.
I see.
If they have homes to go back to. But yeah, so I wouldn't say it's ethnic cleansing or even population transfer necessarily. Sorry.
Okay.
Let me just...
So I guess often a lot of the neighbors are, when the rebels are expelled, they're glad they're expelled, if only because it means that the government will quit bombing. But in any event, they wound up being more trouble than they.
Well, yeah, exactly. I think it's more, if they did have popular support at one point, they ultimately end up losing it because of their behavior, because they end up hoarding food. As we've seen from a lot of testimonies from people who lived under them, they end up hoarding food, they end up hoarding weapons, and, the people end up basically starving while these groups just do what they want and as they please and impose a very brutal, repressive regime on them that's worse than what they lived under before.
Okay. So we alluded at the outset to the kind of blowback you've gotten. The standard thing is what? Like Assad apologist or what?
Yeah, the standard thing is Assadist, which I think is really funny because I've always been really critical of the Syrian government. But that's the standard. But then sometimes it gets really sectarian. And again, like I mentioned earlier, I come from a minority background. My family is Lebanese and Syrian Druze. And so sometimes it ends up being, Rania just hates Sunnis because she's Druze. And that's why she loves Assad, because she's scared of Sunnis, because she's an Islamophobe. So that's become another thing that I find really fascinating is, now I'm an Islamophobe, which is crazy because I've done so much work on Islamophobia and opposing it in the U.S. So, and that tends to happen more within the Arab American community, though, than outside of it, the sort of sectarian backlash.
Okay. Now, I assume a good blowback magnet is to raise questions about how much evidence there is that an alleged chemical weapons attack was actually a chemical weapons attack, right?
Yeah. So my thing is this. I think, and especially in the most recent case, I think we should wait until there's evidence and confirmation, especially when it comes to the U.S. making decisions to bomb a country. And we've seen in the past, the U.S. government has lied before about weapons of mass destruction. So I don't think it's crazy or insane to be skeptical of U.S. government narratives about this kind of thing. On top of that, I think in the past, there has been a lot of questions raised by very credible figures. I think Seymour Hersh is, he's an award-winning journalist that has a career and a track record that proves he's not some ideologue. He really just cares about getting to the bottom of things. We know from his reporting that in 2013, when there was the chemical weapons attack, that even the Obama administration's own intelligence agencies, own intelligence officials were not able to determine for sure who did it. And that was one of the reasons Obama chose not to bomb Syria, because they, for crossing the red line. One thing that's happened to Hersh is he's kind of more or less officially been expelled from mainstream. I don't think the New Yorker published. He's considered too fringy. I have no idea. I haven't looked at his stuff.
I don't know, but that's kind of his
exactly.
status.
That's crazy. But that's like so crazy. Like Seymour Hersh he's won so many awards. He's an award-winning journalist that goes back decades, and it's just amazing that someone like him, for just reporting what his sources are telling them. Again, Seymour Hersh isn't some ideologue who really is invested one way or another in like pushing a narrative. He just has sources and he reports what they tell him. And for doing that, he has, like you said, been expelled, and now he's considered this fringe figure. And now he can only write for like the London Review of Books sometimes. And I think the last article he did when it came to Syria was last year around the Khan Sheikhoun situation. And that was written for like some German outlet. That's crazy. That's what happens around Syria. You can't have, and maybe Seymour Hersh is wrong. Maybe his sources are wrong, right. But you can't even have an open discussion.
Right. No, it's
about these things.
Yeah, chemical weapons are especially, well, I don't know, I was going to say this is too bad a pun, but they are toxic in the sense of, obviously they're horrible and toxic in that sense, but also they are, rhetorically, if you seem to be in any sense, raising questions about them, it's just very dangerous rhetorical terrain, for understandable reasons, because, they're horrible and so on. And if you are, in fact, what you mean to do is actually, condone or excuse their use, that's horrible. But I do think it's always fair to say, before we attack a country on the basis of any, thing they've supposedly done, make sure they did it. My view on, I was just going to say, like, there's like this, okay, when it comes to chemical weapons are awful, but there's also this, I wouldn't say it's like this moral superiority that people like to, when they talk about chemical weapons, which is funny because the U.S. itself has been engaged in selling them to awful, atrocious people in the past. We countenanced Saddam Hussein's, we were a de facto supporter of Saddam Hussein's when he was killing tens of thousands of Kurds. At least, if not 150,000. What?
He also used it against Iran. Like, we condoned that as well. But yeah, Saddam Hussein. Yeah. And that's what I mean by this double standard. I mean, you've got the Israelis using white phosphorus as a, not as a cover of war, but as like an actual weapon against Palestinians in Gaza. And these things don't create the same sort of, horror among the people who are, most like demanding that you either accept the State Department narrative on Syria's use of chemical weapons, no questions allowed. You just don't hear the same, anger.
I mean, I would say that the way you put it was that, the U.S. lied about weapons of mass destruction. They could be lying about this. I wouldn't necessarily assume it's, in a way, in either case. I mean, I think with Iraq, and I was against the Iraq war before it was cool. In other words, before the war. But I think to some extent, some people in government just talked themselves into it. Like Colin Powell, I don't think he knew he was not telling the truth before the UN and so on. And I think similarly in Syria, the U.S. government, I mean, look, Bolton at some level would love to have the most excuses possible to inflict the most violence, and so he's happy to believe it happened. I mean, I think if there's deception, it could be, at the level of the rebels. I mean, there are two kinds of deception. You can out and out fake the attack, which I think is difficult, or it can be a so-called false flag attack where you plant the chemical weapon, the rebels, and then they say the opposition done. These are things that can, in principle, at least happen. Now, I will say the earlier famous chemical weapons attack from some years ago, I guess this is the one where Obama wound up not retaliating, in part because he went to Congress, asked Congress if they'd support him, and they kind of didn't, But in any event, in that case, I remember Josh Landis, who I really respect on Syria, said he thought it had been a government chemical weapons attack. So it
could have been. It totally could have been. I mean, I'm not denying it couldn't have been. I mean, but it just, there is reasons to ask questions about this, especially when you have the international community, the most powerful countries in the world, telling Syria, this is a red line, don't cross it. And then, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, then maybe the Syrian government's really stupid. It's totally plausible. I don't doubt that they would not use chemical weapons because they're not capable of it. Like, I don't think the Syrian government is not capable of using chemical weapons. I just think that especially in the most recent case, but even in 2013, there are enough questions to be raised that say, okay, but did they? Yeah. And that to me is enough for it's like at least a little reasonable doubt. You know what I'm saying? Before you're going to go all in bombing. And in the most recent case, I mean, the timing was just remarkable. you had the Syrian government on the precipice of like completely defeating the insurgents in eastern Ghouta. They had no reason to use chemical weapons. And it's also, again, crossing this red line. They have no tactical benefit to using chemical weapons. Like I mentioned earlier, conventional bombs do plenty of damage. The Syrian government was, in fact, heavily bombarding eastern Ghouta when the chemical weapons claim was made. They were heavily bombing it with conventional weapons for sure. And then, like you mentioned with the insurgents, I mean, we do know that they also have chemical weapons capabilities as well. So if there was an attack, it could have been them. I could sit here and speculate, though, all day about it. I don't actually know what happened. I wasn't on the ground. And even if there was a chemical weapons attack, we also have to ask, like, what's the point of bombing Syria? Is that really the appropriate reaction or response? Like, is it going to do anything? Is it going to change anything? Do we want to change the situation on the ground? Is it going to make it better or worse?
Yeah. Well, I mean, also, I mean, I'm kind of a pretty unusual in the extent to which I pay attention to international law. And it's like one thing if you get the Security Council to authorize the punishment for the use of chemical weapons, in which case the response itself would be in keeping with international law. But if you don't do that, it's a case where you're punishing what may indeed be a violation of international law if the attack happened, but you're doing so unlawfully. It's like the analogy I've used: if my neighbor has a meth lab, that's illegal. But if I break in, that's illegal too. The cops have to do it. So the only other thing I'd say about the recent case was that Trump bombed the day before the international inspectors were set to arrive in Syria to actually start gathering evidence. I'd love to know what the urgency was. You know, why?
You know, I wonder if it was just, that's a good question. And I wonder if it was just because he was talking so big about it for so long, he felt he had to do something. Because at the end of the day, they didn't actually, it was like almost a symbolic bombing, right?
Yeah.
Actually accomplished, they bombed a bunch of empty buildings.
Yeah, well, I think
that's it. That's all that happened.
I think that's an intra-administration argument that Mattis actually won. Bolton wanted to do more, and Mattis. So it was a very measured response. But anyway, the international inspectors have now visited, but have not issued their report. Of course, they're not going to assign responsibility anyway. They're just going to establish whether a chemical weapons attack happened. That wouldn't totally rule out the possibility of a false flag attack. But in any event, what seemed to me completely indefensible is not at least waiting for the authorized international inspectors to do their job. Anyway, anything else you want to say about? Well, I think one thing we should briefly touch on, which I've heard you talk about elsewhere, is that one thing to understand is that because a lot of journalists actually don't spend as much time in Syria as you have spent, some of them rely entirely on public relations kind of outlets that, or largely rely on public relations outlets that are in fact rebel mouthpieces. I mean, that's your view. I don't know, but that's your view, right?
Yeah, no, that's actually the reality. And I actually don't necessarily entirely blame Western journalists for that completely, because, well, I do blame them for relying on biased sources that they know are biased. But that said, the Syrian government does itself no favors with the way it behaves with journalists. They're just not, they don't do a good job with journalists. They're terrible with media. It's not an easy experience going to Syria as a journalist. So I don't blame people for not being able to necessarily visit, because it's not an easy thing to do, especially as an American or a Westerner. That said, my issue as well is there has been this, like you mentioned, there's this entire industry that's been funded by, the UK Foreign Office, the US State Department, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. It's just basically rebel propaganda. I actually had a colleague who's a really well-established journalist who works in the Middle East. He speaks fluent Arabic. He reads and writes it. And he was actually offered $17,000 a month by a UK Foreign Office funded outlet to go be based in Gaziantep, Turkey, and write rebel propaganda. Like to write
for which group? Which group was he going to be working for?
It was an outlet in Arabic. It was an Arabic outlet called RFS Media.
Why is the British government why are they so invested in this?
I mean, probably for the same reasons the U.S. is invested in Syria, trying to weaken the government. That's just been, it's a long-time foreign policy ambition of the West, is to weaken the Syrian government for a multitude of reasons. But they spent a lot of money on propaganda. And so that's just, I mean, just imagine, that's a lot of money, $17,000 a month. There's freelance journalists I know who make less than that a year. And so that's a lot of money to take for a month. And so that, because you have all this rebel propaganda and the Syrian government is so bad at media, and then also you can't really visit rebel areas, right? Because you can try to visit Syrian government areas and you might be able to. You can't visit rebel areas because as a Western journalist, especially, you'll be kidnapped, ransomed, or killed, or sold off to ISIS and then killed. So Western journalists, like years ago, stopped going to Syria. And so you actually saw the coverage become even more biased towards the rebels, weirdly enough, after that. So yeah, you have all of these Western journalists that are relying exclusively on rebel propaganda outlets. And that's literally the coverage you get is the rebel narrative only. And I actually don't, again, like I do fault the Syrian government for being bad with media, but I don't think that makes it okay to be as one-sided and as reliant on people based in Gaziantep, Turkey, as the Western press has been.
Are there journalists you would recommend who, I mean, are there any kind of mainstream journalists who, from your point of view, are kind of appropriately discounting the biases of the rebel sources and doing a good job of getting something closer to an objective view?
It's not even just necessarily discounting the rebel view. It's at least presenting both narratives, right? Because you don't necessarily know which one is true. I think one really excellent journalist has been Nabil Boulos at the LA Times. He's also, I think, one of the reasons he's been able to be more, I guess, neutral. I wouldn't say neutral, but more objective, I suppose, which isn't something I always promote, objectivity. But in his case, I think part of it's because he's from the region. He speaks Arabic fluently, and he's able to talk to all kinds of people, not just people who are able to talk to him, if that makes sense. But he's, I think, been somebody who's been really fair. I guess, I don't know. I can't. And I wouldn't say every Western journalist has been awful and everything they've produced is terrible. And sometimes even in accounts that are extremely biased, if you read between the lines, you can see some, pieces of reality. But I think one really good piece was by Robert Worth. He wrote something for the New York Times Magazine last year. He visited East Aleppo. Some of the Financial Times reporting has been really good. I can't think of any specific bylines. They're kind of blanking on that. But so, I mean, there's bits and pieces here and there. There've been some good things in foreign policy. Rania Abu Zaid, that's someone I should say, Rania Abu Zaid, who just came out with a book on Syria. I don't always agree with, what she says about the opposition, but I think that she's been pretty fair and she spent a lot of time with the opposition. And I think she gives a really complex view of what they are and how they became what they became. And a lot of her reporting has been excellent. So I do think that there are sources you can definitely look to. They're just few and far between.
And are there particularly horrible journalists? Would you like to add to your long list of enemies by naming some of them?
Okay. I don't want to get personal or anything like that. Cause I don't dislike people there's people I know who I think are terrible, have been terrible on Syria, but I like them as people. But there's one journalist who I don't know and I've never met, Martin Shulov of The Guardian. I think his reporting has been some of the most biased and shocking at times. He actually produced a report, I think last year, based on the claims of a Harar al-Sham communications guy that the Syrian government was ethnically cleansing insurgent areas and replacing Sunnis with Shias from Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran, which is a complete lie. And you really shouldn't be basing an entire, article on the claims of one guy from a Salafi jihadist group. And there's no evidence of this on the ground. So I give him a shout out for that terrible article.
Okay. Final quick question, just because I remember, I alluded to it at the beginning. You're in Lebanon. This won't air for a few days, but still, in the very recent past, there will have been an election, and Hezbollah did pretty well, I understand it. It's not like they have a majority or anything, but they have strengthened their position within Lebanese politics. Is that going to play into any of this in an obvious way? I mean, I guess if part of the retaliation for if Israel keeps attacking Iranian assets in Syria and Iran decides to retaliate, one possible arm of retaliation is, of course, can come from Lebanon. There are missiles in Lebanon, and I guess the election would make it. Does that make that a little more likely that Iran could actually use that lever, or what?
Well, okay, so I think that it's actually mistaken for people to just view to view Hezbollah as just some arm of Iran. I mean, Hezbollah is a Lebanese group. They are supported by Iran, no question, funded. They receive help from Iran. But at the same time, I would say Hezbollah and Iran are actually more like partners who have similar objectives and a similar agenda. But at the end of the day, Hezbollah is Lebanese and has to play to a Lebanese audience. And again, their involvement in Syria had nothing to do with Iran. It had to do with Hezbollah maintaining its survival and Lebanon's, in many ways, survival, because Lebanon was under threat by extremist groups coming into Lebanon. So Hezbollah does not want a war with Israel. They really don't want a war with Israel. They could go to war with Israel and they could do damage to Israel because they've gained a lot of experience from Syria, but they don't want a war with Israel. And I really strongly reject the idea that Hezbollah would, on behalf of Iran, retaliate against Israel. I just don't see that happening because it's not in Hezbollah's interest. At the end of the day, Hezbollah has to worry about the Lebanese population because that's who elects them. And that's something about Lebanon that's forgotten. Lebanon, is lacking a strong state. At the same time, they do have democratic elections, and that's what Hezbollah just won. It's not like they're imposing themselves in this country. They are popular. They have a popular base of support, and it's because they're considered a resistance, not just at this point to Israel anymore, but as well as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They're considered resistance against, I guess, Israel and Saudi Arabia is how people see them. So anyways, I guess my point is I don't think Hezbollah would retaliate against Israel on Iran's behalf. I do, however, think that we are in dangerous territory now where the fact that Hezbollah does have a stronger presence in Lebanon will be something that's used in Israel's narrative and America's narrative, perhaps as well, as a reason to go to war.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
It does make sense. Well, thank you for taking the time. Good luck with the blowback. I guess will I now be will I get blowback for just talking to you now?
You probably will. You probably will. I'm sure someone will say, "Why did you have that Assadistan?" But I will say this: I do appreciate your willingness to have me on and to discuss these things with me, at least openly. Because at the end of the day, I think that's really lacking, and that needs to happen more. Is to have more of a debate and a discussion around these issues, even with people who don't know done everything about them. So thank you for having me on. And I apologize in advance preemptively about the potential blowback. Yeah,
well, maybe after we go offline, you can tell me who it's going to come from. We probably don't want to mention their names. That will only encourage them, I guess. Or would that be a deterrent? I got to think this through in terms of game theory. But anyway, but thank you. Where can people find your stuff? What's your Twitter handle and so on?
My Twitter handle is at Rania Khalek, RaniaKhalek. And I also have a website that I haven't been updating, but I'll start to update more with my work. It's raniakhalek.com.
Okay.
And so, yeah, that's probably the best. And Facebook as well.
Any recent articles we should link to?
I actually have a couple going up soon at Keep Your Eye on the Gray Zone project. I have some other articles I wrote for Alternet in the recent past, but it's been a while. But I have some articles related to Syria that will be going up soon, especially the reconciliation process in Syria. So we may, if we link to those, they can be found on the version of this that's on meaningoflife.tv. There's also a YouTube version, but if you're watching on YouTube and want some links to your Twitter handle and other things, they'll be on the meaningoflife.tv site. Thanks, Rania. Good luck. Thank you, Bob. It was great chatting with you.
See ya.